Godhead and his power, or excuse me, his eternal power in Godhead, so that they are without excuse. That's what they're holding down. That's what's in the jack-in-the-box, and what's in verse number 19 and verse number 20. Notice the phrases here that speak of God's obvious creation. He says, look around. What you're holding down that could tell you that there's a God that you're accountable to, and you're going around and you're living your own life, not looking at God, you won't be saved, you will not, religion is a crutch and all of that, and you want to live your own life, you want to ignore the truth of Christ, you want to ignore the truth that there's a God in heaven, that I'm accountable to Him someday, that He made things. What you're holding down is so obvious. Look around at creation, look at the phrases in verse 19 and 20. It says, that which may be known of God. It's obvious. Manifest, there's the word. Hath showed it unto them, clearly seen, being understood. The truth that there is a God and that we are accountable to Him is in neon lights in creation. Listen, the power and the order and the awe of creation isn't exactly done in a corner. It's not like He's hiding it. It's not like that He's hiding the truth that He's there. That you have to work hard to figure it out. What? It's not like the accountability to God and what we'll see, these two phrases, are something that's hidden that man even has to search for. Open up your eyes, unbelievers, and know that there is a God. Know it. It's everywhere. It's obvious. It cannot be hidden. All around mankind is power and glory and majesty and wonder. It is obviously the work of God. It's obviously God out there. That's why creation is so beautiful. Because God was putting together an advertisement, and His advertisement campaigns are always successful. That's why creation is so dimensional. It's why it's not just flat. It's why it's powerful and rich in color and texture and design and organization and mechanics and botany and vast space. God posted an obvious billboard and He advertised Himself so that it would be so obvious and manifest and clearly seen in all these phrases that there is a God and I have to somehow relate to Him. And every man or child that's ever been born, it is so obvious that God advertises that He is here and you had better be right with Him. That billboard of creation speaks of His reality. It is that which may be known of God in verse number 19. Outside of the Bible, without any words, the obvious things of creation. And what does creation obviously show? There's two things it says at the end of verse number 20 that it shows. First of all, His eternal power. When any person, saved or lost, goes outside and looks around at creation, doesn't any research in science, goes to see pictures of the depths of the sea, it speaks of God's eternal power. This word eternal is only used twice in the New Testament. It's not the other eternal and everlasting that you see in John 3:16 and other verses. It's only used twice in your English Bible. Eternal here means something that cannot be interrupted. It's something that is permanent and something that is unchangeable. It's a little bit different meaning than eternal, everlasting, and other places. Something that cannot be interrupted, God's power. Something that is permanent, God's power. And something that is unchangeable, you're not going to mess with. God's power is that. Kind of frightfully, the other place that it's used, the only other place of something that is not interrupted and something that's permanent and something that is unchangeable, is the lake of fire. When a man looks around at creation and how much more powerful it is than any human or any nation or any organization, it makes him realize that he is an ant and God is so powerful and God never could be foiled. He can never be stopped. He can never be interrupted. He can never be fought with. He can never be changed. God says, I made creation so that every person would know that that is obvious. My eternal power. You're not anything like me. Verse number 20 says that conclusion is obvious. From the wonders of creation, it clearly understood by mankind without a Bible, without a preacher, without anything except nature. Verse number 20 says there's something else that is obvious, and that is His Godhead. Notice the scripture, it says, For the invisible things of him, of God, from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, that's us, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse, his Godhead. This is the word deity. The word God is really in it, theos. It's part of this word. It's the idea that God, godness, that he is not like man. He is godness. It speaks of his kingship. It speaks of his morality. It speaks of his holiness. It speaks of my accountability to him because he is holy and I'm not. That, God says, is clearly seen. When you look outside and you see that somebody made all of these things, and obviously your conscience is working with these, that he is perfect and he is pure and organized in all his ways, and he is holy and he is the king and he is God and I am not. His godness is something that is obvious from creation, his deity. God says in verse number 19 and 20 that these 2 points are preached to every human being, and because that is true, all men are without excuse. Do you see that in verse 20? That all men are without excuse. When men walk around here and they're saying things like, what is truth and all the kinds of things, God says, look around. I guarantee you, if you look around and you seriously consider it, you will come to at least 2 conclusions. Number 1, that I, God, have eternal power. I cannot be messed with. You're accountable to me. Number 2, I am God. That is, I am something to be worshipped. I am deity. These 2 things, every person who can see or hear or experience creation should obviously know. They're without excuse if they don't. Without excuse for what? To be saved? No, it doesn't say that. They're without excuse. Creation cannot save a man. He has to know Jesus Christ. The man in the depths of India or Africa can look around at creation and know these 2 things and know that they are accountable to God, but unless they hear the message of Jesus Christ, they die and go to hell. You say that's not fair. No, what is fair is for God to send every person to hell. That's fair if you want to start talking about fair. That's what we deserve. But God's grace, his mercy, through Jesus Christ, spares those who will hear and believe. So what are they without excuse for? Well, God's eternal power and his Godhead it takes away every man's excuse that they did not know better to live in ungodliness and unrighteousness in verse number 18. A guy that goes around and says, well, I just sin every day of my life. I follow sin. I follow after sin. I lived a life of unrighteousness and ungodliness. He's without excuse. He should have known there's a God and he's accountable to that God. He should have not lived that way. He has no excuse for his sin, even though he may never have heard the Bible, because nature demands that there is a God and we need to be right with him. For those of you who like apologetics, here are 2 wonderful points to argue the existence of God and the accountability of mankind to God. Creation obviously shows the eternal power and God's godness over us. The majority of man will not face this obvious truth. They sit on jack-of-the-boxes and continue in their ungodliness and unrighteousness. They want to. It's available to them if they would just give themselves for a moment to think about all this organization, all this beauty of creation. It would come to them that there is a God, but they don't want to hear it. They would rather do unrighteousness. They don't want to be accountable. And friend, before Jesus saved me, I didn't want to be accountable. There's nothing different from those men than me except the grace of God. That's the only difference. And there's no difference between any one of you but the grace of God. We sat on our own jack-in-the-boxes. Because of their rebellion and unbelief, verse number 18 says, the wrath of God has and is and will be exposed on them. The rest of the chapter is a present view of mankind, but also a history of how man has rebelled against God's truth, and even from creation, from the beginning of time. Now, I want to slow down. I want everybody wake up and to understand this, because this is where we're going to go in future weeks. Beginning in verse number 21 to verse number 32 is a present account of what man's like and what you and I are like, but by Christ. But it's also kind of a history. It's kind of what happened after the fall of man in the Garden of Eden. And it's kind of a history that goes through the stages. In fact, Schofield notes in his Study Notes Bible that there are 7 stages of apostasy, okay? That's fine to understand, but what we really understand is that man is running away from God. And then they need Jesus Christ. And the only way that they're going to be saved is if we give them the gospel. The unsaved man doesn't want to see the wonders of nature and recognize God. Look at verse 21. Because that